Hey guys, tonight we fall into a forest of fantasy where fairy tales start sweet, but quickly turn sour. You're probably imagining a beautiful girl, skin white as snow, lips red as blood, and hair black as night. She's surrounded by singing birds and helpful woodland creatures. It's peaceful. But don't relax just yet. That fairy tale forest hides some thorns, because behind the polished Disney version of Snow White is a tale far older, far stranger, and far darker. You've probably heard the basics: a jealous queen, a magic mirror, a poisoned apple, a beautiful girl in a glass coffin. But tonight, we're digging into what most versions won't tell you: the creepy truth about Snow White's age, the gruesome rituals tucked into the original tale, and the possibility that this story was never just a story. Here's a hint. You probably wouldn't survive a day in the real grim fairy tale, especially not if you were a 14-year-old girl with good skin and political value. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're tuning in from tonight and what time it is where you are. Drop it in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story opens, as most tales do, with a wish. A queen, sitting by a snowy window, pricks her finger while sewing and dreams of a daughter with skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony. And just like that, poof, a baby is born. Snow White. Sounds innocent, right? But this is no ordinary fairy tale. That innocent wish is the first red flag. It comes from a long tradition of magical birth rituals where blood, beauty, and destiny are tangled together. Snow White is more than a child. She's a symbol of youth, of purity, and most dangerously, of power. The queen dies soon after, of course, because stepmothers always need a dramatic entrance. And the new queen? She's got a magic mirror, a ruthless streak, and one obsession: being the fairest of them all. Historians still argue whether this character was meant to represent real historical anxieties about aging, lineage, or women losing power once they're no longer young and fertile. But one thing's clear: the mirror doesn't lie. Or does it? In this early part of the tale, Snow White is just a child, but her beauty is already a threat. That's the chilling part. In the world of this story, being beautiful is both a gift and a death sentence. And when the queen finally hears that Snow White has surpassed her in beauty, she doesn't just get jealous, she gets homicidal. Her plan? Hire a huntsman to carve out the girl's lungs and liver, bring them back in a box, and eat them. Yes, seriously. So buckle up. We're only getting started, and the woods are about to get a whole lot darker. The brothers who first wrote down Snow White weren't Disney animators or bedtime storybook makers. They were two German scholars named Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. And their real job? Hunting down old folk tales from rural villagers, farmers, and peasants, then writing them down in a way that would preserve pure German culture. Sounds noble, until you realize how creepy and disturbing those original stories actually were. When the Grimms published their first edition of Children's and Household Tales, in 1812, Snow White wasn't even close to the soft, sanitized story you might know. The tale was called Little Snow White, and it featured a lot more blood, organs, and disturbing behavior than most people would expect. Think fewer chirping birds, and more stepmother cannibalism. See, the Grimms didn't invent these tales. They collected them. And often the stories came from women, housewives, aristocrats, or servants, who passed them down through word of mouth. Some researchers believe the tales were originally warnings or coded messages, maybe even survival guides wrapped in fantasy. Historians still argue whether the Grimms edited more than they admitted, because in truth, they changed a lot, usually to suit their growing audience of middle-class families and children. Snow White is a perfect example of that slow transformation. In earlier oral versions of the tale, the evil queen was Snow White's biological mother, not her stepmother. Yep, mom wants her daughter dead because she's prettier. Grim, indeed. Later editions swapped in a stepmother to make it less horrifying. But you can still feel the raw edge in the story's bones. And let's talk about that magic mirror. In the Grimm version, it's not just a talking decoration. It's a relentless voice of truth. The queen asks it daily, "Mirror, mirror, on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" And when the mirror finally answers, "You, my queen, are fair," it is true. But Snow White is 1,000 times fairer than you. She doesn't cry. She doesn't scheme. She immediately plans a murder. There's something cold and calculating about her reaction. This wasn't about hurt feelings. It was about power. In many ways, beauty in this story is currency. And once Snow White becomes fairer, the queen is bankrupt. One quirky detail in the early versions: the queen doesn't just want the girl dead. She wants to eat her lungs and liver after the huntsman brings them back in a box. It's not symbolic. She literally plans to cook them with salt and consume them. Some scholars think this was a twisted way to absorb the girl's beauty or life force. Others think it reflects old ideas about royal cannibalism, believing one could gain strength from eating youth. Either way, you. And the huntsman? He has second thoughts. Instead of killing Snow White, he lets her go into the forest and kills a wild boar instead, bringing back its no lungs and liver to fool the queen. She eats them, thinking she's devoured her rival. Sleep well with that in your head tonight. But this is just the beginning. Snow White is about to vanish into the woods, and the story will only get darker from here. The version of Snow White you probably know has been cleaned up a lot. But if we peel back the layers of sweetness and songbirds, we uncover something much grittier. In the very first printed version from 1812, the tale wasn't just darker, it was bloodier. Let's start with Snow White herself. She's not an adult. She's not even a teenager in some early drafts. In the Grimm's original, she's just 70 years old when the mirror says she's the fairest of them all. Yes, 7. A child. And yet somehow, a deadly threat to a grown queen's vanity. Later editions bumped her age up, first to 12, then to 14, probably to make the story feel less disturbing. But even then, it's still unsettling. At 14, you're just barely beginning to grow into yourself. In the real world, she wouldn't be holding a job yet, let alone marrying a prince. Historians still argue whether the Grimms understood how inappropriate this was or if they were simply reflecting the social norms of their time. After all, in 19th century Europe, girls were often considered marriageable by their early teens. Not romantic, just reality. But that doesn't make it any less jarring to modern ears. Once Snow White flees into the forest, terrified and alone, the story quickly shifts into survival mode. The forest in folklore is never just a bunch of trees. It's a symbol of chaos, of danger, of transformation. It's the place where the rules of the world break down, where monsters lurk, and where girls disappear. And who does Snow White find in the woods? 7 dwarfs, of course. But in the 1812 version, they're not named. They're not cartoonish. And they don't sing about whistling while they work. They're miners, grim, bearded, and rough around the edges. Probably real-life inspired. Mining was common in Germany, especially in mountainous regions like the Harz Mountains, where legends about little people and underground spirits were widespread. There's even a quirky theory that the dwarfs represent real child laborers, young boys sent to work in narrow mine shafts, their growth stunted by poor nutrition and dangerous work. Dwarfs weren't magical, they were metaphorical, and they were exhausted. Snow White doesn't stumble upon their cottage and clean it out of kindness either. In some early versions, she simply eats their food and falls asleep in one of their beds. It's only after she's discovered that they strike a deal. She can stay, but only if she agrees to cook, clean, and keep house while they work. Sound like a fairy tale, or more like a child entering indentured servitude? Still, the forest becomes a kind of twisted haven. Here, away from the queen, Snow White survives. But survival doesn't mean safety, because soon the queen will realize she's been tricked. And the next attempt on Snow White's life, it'll be even more disturbing. This isn't just a bedtime story, it's a slow-burning horror with a very young girl at the center and someone who wants her dead no matter what it takes. The Wicked Queen isn't done, not even close. When she finds out Snow White is still alive, hiding in the woods with 7 rough little miners, she doesn't scream or throw a tantrum. No, she gets quiet, calculated, and very, very creative. In the Grimm version, this next part is where things get even more sinister. and strangely theatrical. The queen doesn't just send a hitman this time, she goes herself. Disguised. Not once, but 3 times. Each time, she brings a gift. Each gift is a trap. First, she shows up at the dwarf's cottage disguised as a peddler woman. Her trick? Tight lace. She offers Snow White a beautiful new bodice, then laces it so tightly that the girl collapses, unable to breathe. Dead? Almost. The dwarfs find her, cut the strings, and revive her. Close call. But the queen's just warming up. The second time she returns with a poisoned comb. Snow White, ever trusting, lets her kind old lady comb her hair. As soon as the comb touches her scalp, she falls again, like a puppet with its strings cut. Again, the dwarfs save her. They remove the comb, and she wakes up. And then comes the apple. This is the most famous attempt, and probably the darkest. The queen, still in disguise, offers a perfect red apple, only half of it poisoned. That's the genius of it. She takes a bite from the safe side. Snow White, reassured, takes the other. And this time, there's no saving her. She drops to the floor, seemingly lifeless. Historians still argue whether these 3 death attempts were symbolic, each representing a different stage of female life. The bodice, coming of age, the comb, vanity or beauty, and the apple, temptation or sexual awakening. It's a theory with layers, but even on the surface it's creepy how often young girls in fairy tales are tricked by beauty products. And remember, this dead girl is about 14. That's barely high school age. Yet here she is, poisoned by an apple from a stranger, laid out in a glass box in the woods, surrounded by grief-stricken dwarfs. One quirky historical footnote: the whole apple as death thing might come from older German folklore. Apples were sometimes associated with both knowledge and mortality. In one 17th century folktale, a woman gives her rival an apple to make her sick out of jealousy. Sound familiar? Also, in this version of the story, there's no magical kiss. Snow White doesn't wake up because of love. She wakes up because someone drops her. Literally. But we'll get to that. For now, just picture it. A child in a glass coffin, preserved for beauty, frozen in time, and a queen who returns home thinking she's finally won. But fairy tales love a twist, and this one's about to get weird. So there she lies, Snow White, motionless in her glass coffin. A child bride in waiting. The dwarfs, heartbroken, can't bring themselves to bury her. Instead, they craft a transparent sarcophagus and place her inside. They keep watch, day and night, mourning her beauty more than her actual life. Now pause for a second. This isn't just weird, it's deeply unsettling. A young girl frozen in time, displayed like a work of art in the middle of the forest. It sounds more like a twisted museum piece than a funeral. Historians still argue whether the glass coffin was a metaphor for idealized female purity, untouched, silent, and beautiful in death. And glass coffins? Not just fantasy. During the 18th and 19th centuries, some elite families did preserve their dead in open caskets or even glass cases. In rare cases, bodies were embalmed and displayed in churches or crypts for public reverence. Creepy, yes, but not totally unheard of. Meanwhile, the dwarfs refuse to move on. It's like Snow White's death has frozen them too. The story goes quiet for a long time here. Seasons pass, years maybe. No queen, no prince, just stillness, which makes what happens next all the more jarring. One day, a prince rides by. He sees the coffin, sees the girl inside, and, brace yourself, falls instantly in love with a corpse, or what he thinks is a corpse. Depending on the version you read, he either kisses her or simply begs the dwarfs to let him take her with him. Not revive her, not bury her, just keep her. Yeah, let that settle in. In some versions, the dwarfs hesitate, because it's weird. But the prince is so heartbroken over a girl he's never met that they eventually say yes. He and his men lift the coffin, and somewhere along the journey, a jolt knocks loose the piece of poisoned apple from her throat. She wakes up. Historians still argue about this part. Was it meant to be a love story? Or was it a comment on how women were literally awakened by marriage? Some scholars believe it's a twisted take on arranged unions, young girls asleep to the world, suddenly rescued by marriage to a stranger. The quirky detail here? In one version, the prince doesn't even kiss her. He's just walking along, carting her body away like some kind of floral arrangement, when a servant drops the coffin and dislodges the fruit. Oops, she's alive. Snow White opens her eyes, sees a man she's never met, and somehow agrees to marry him. She never asks, "Who are you?" or "Why am I not dead?" Just, "Sure, let's go with this." And that, friends, is where the happily ever after starts. With a stranger, a bump in the road, and a girl who barely got to be a child. But we're not done, because the queen hasn't had her last word yet. And what comes next might be the most chilling part of all. Now let's talk about something people tend to skip over. Snow White's age. Not in passing, not as trivia, but head on. Because once you see it clearly, the whole story shifts into something far less magical. In most modern versions, Snow White appears young but ambiguous, maybe 16, maybe 17. Old enough for romance, young enough for innocence. But the Grimm brothers? They weren't vague. In their 1857 version, they stated her age flat out. 14 years old. 14. Now pause. Imagine a 14-year-old. Braces, awkward laughs, still figuring out what eyeliner even does. Not exactly the portrait of a girl ready to marry a royal stranger who carts her off in a coffin. But that's exactly what happens. And it's not framed as unusual. In fact, it's celebrated as a reward. She's beautiful, so she is chosen. She is passive, so she is valued. She is young, so she is perfect. Historians still argue whether the Grimms intended to normalize child brides or whether they were simply recording what was already common. Because yes, 14 wasn't considered scandalous back then. In many parts of 18th and 19th century Europe, especially among the nobility, girls were engaged, sometimes even married, at shockingly young ages. It wasn't always about love. It was about alliances, land, power, and yes, beauty. A girl like Snow White, beautiful and obedient, would have been seen as the perfect political pawn. But still, the image of a prince falling in love with a dead 14-year-old in a glass box? That should feel wrong. It does feel wrong. And yet in this story, it's told like a fairy tale. The quirky part? Some early artistic illustrations of Snow White, drawn in the 19th century, actually make her look like a child. Not a youthful maiden. A young child. Small stature, round cheeks, ribbons in her hair. Artists were leaning into her innocence, which makes the prince's obsession even harder to swallow. And let's talk about the language. When Snow White wakes up, she says almost nothing. She never objects, never asks questions, just goes along with the plan. This silence isn't an accident. It's part of the message. Good girls are quiet. They don't question. They don't resist. They just smile, bat their lashes, and accept their fate. But Snow White isn't sleeping through life because she's lazy or cursed. She's sleeping because the story requires her to be helpless. That's the fantasy. A beautiful, unconscious girl, ready to be claimed. Creepy, right? And it's not just a detail. It's the mas center narn of the story. The thing that launches the happy ending. But don't worry. Our dear queen isn't done yet. She's going to find out Snow White is alive. And her reaction? Let's just say it involves some very hot shoes. So, the queen thinks Snow White is dead. Finally. She's danced her 3-act murder show, eaten what she believes are the girl's organs, and gone home to stare lovingly into her mirror again. But fairy tales don't let villains rest. One day, the mirror, her trusty, slightly sassy truth-teller, breaks the news. You, my queen, are fair, it is true, but the young queen is fairer than you. Boom! That one sentence undoes everything. She's not just mad now. She's unraveling. Because Snow White isn't just alive. She's been promoted. The mirror calls her the young queen. Translation? She's married, elevated, crowned. The nightmare for a jealous stepmother isn't just that her stepdaughter is prettier. It's that she's more powerful. Historians still argue whether the mirror in this tale represents society's judgment or the queen's own fractured psyche. Either way, it's a brutal reminder. She can never win. Age is coming. Beauty fades, and now even death couldn't erase the competition. But let's talk about that marriage for a second. Snow White, still just 14, is now someone's queen. She rules beside a man she's just met, who fell for her while she was presumed dead. That's not romance. That's a case file. And how do they celebrate this uncomfortable union? With a wedding feast, of course, huge, grand, everyone's invited, including the queen. Yep, Snow White, now alive and royal, sends out invitations to her murderer. Bold move. And the queen? She accepts, because she still doesn't know the bride is Snow White. She walks in, dripping in envy and oblivion, until she sees the girl, alive, radiant, seated on the throne. And that's when things go full horror show. Here comes the quirky, gruesome twist. To punish the queen, the new king, or sometimes the dwarfs depending on the version, heats up a pair of iron shoes in a fire, burning hot, red as coals. And then, in front of everyone, the queen is forced to wear them. She dances in agony, her feet sizzling until she falls down dead. This punishment? Not subtle. It's medieval justice meets sadistic theater, and it's the final image the Grimms chose to end on. A twisted party, a tortured guest, and a silent girl watching her tormentor burn. Was it deserved? Maybe. Was it terrifying? Absolutely. Some scholars believe the shoes symbolized the queen's vanity, burning her from the bottom up. Others think it was just a way to end the tale with maximum shock. Historians still argue whether this punishment was lifted from real practices. There were medieval torture devices involving heated metal, but nothing quite like this stylish footwear of doom. Either way, Snow White doesn't flinch. She doesn't speak. She doesn't blink. The story ends with her standing tall, crowned, married, and silent. And that silence? It might be the most haunting thing of all. Snow White isn't just a story about magic and jealousy. It's a lesson in how beauty equals power. From the very start, her appearance defines her worth. Skin white as snow, lips red as blood, hair black as ebony. That's not just poetic. That's branding. In her world, beauty is everything. It's why the queen hates her. It's why the huntsman spares her. It's why the prince falls in love with a glass coffin. Snow White doesn't need to speak, think, or act. She just has to be beautiful. And that, oddly enough, makes her dangerous. Historians still argue whether this tale was meant to reinforce or critique that idea. Was it warning girls about the dangers of being too pretty, or teaching them that prettiness is their most valuable weapon? The answer shifts depending on how you squint at it. But one thing is clear, beauty in this story isn't soft and sweet. It's political. It's violent. It topples queens and crowns teenagers. And it's never safe. The quirky twist? In some lesser-known European versions of Snow White, the heroine isn't just beautiful, she's literally a doll, brought to life. In those tellings, her perfection is so unnatural, so unchanging, that she seems barely human. Creepy, right? Like a porcelain figure placed on a shelf, admired but never really alive. And don't forget the queen side of things. She's not just jealous, she's desperate. She knows what losing beauty means in her world. Not just fewer compliments, but a total loss of power. Her husband, gone. Her throne, slipping. Her only currency, evaporating. So when she asks the mirror every day who's fairest, it's not vanity. It's survival. One wrong answer and she knows what's coming. Irrelevance. That's the game Snow White was born into. A contest she didn't choose, but one she couldn't escape. Her beauty made her both prize and threat, and the world around her responded accordingly, trying to claim her, kill her, preserve her. Even the dwarves don't protect her out of love. They're entranced by her appearance. They make her clean and cook in exchange for shelter. The second she breaks the rules by opening the door to strangers, she's left to suffer the consequences. And the prince? He doesn't rescue her from danger. He rescues her from stillness. Because even in death or coma or magical suspension, whatever it was, her beauty still pulls him in. It's not a love story, it's a look story. And that coffin? That wasn't a tomb, it was a display case, a showcase for the fairest of them all. So the next time someone calls Snow White a tale of true love, just remember, her value came from her face. Her silence was her charm, and her beauty, that was her curse. By the time the Grimm brothers had finished editing Snow White, the story looked very different from its first appearance. What began as a raw, haunting folktale was slowly reshaped into something more appropriate for middle-class families. But don't let the edits fool you. Some of the darkness still seeped through the cracks. In the earliest 1812 edition, we got the biological mother as villain, the queen eating organs, and Snow White as a child of 7. But in later editions, especially the 1857 one, which most people recognize, things changed. The queen became a stepmother. Snow White got a puberty bump to 14, and some of the gruesome details softened slightly. Historians still argue whether the Grimms were trying to protect children or just appeal to book-buying parents. Either way, their edits tell a story of their own. The Grimms weren't just collectors. They were moralizers. They believed fairy tales should teach children how to behave. And Snow White? She became a walking lesson in obedience, modesty, and caution. One quirky thing they kept, though, the iron shoes, burning a woman alive at your wedding, apparently still fit for the nursery. What the Grimms didn't remove says just as much as what they did. Snow White still gets punished for curiosity. She opens the door when she shouldn't. She takes gifts from strangers. She disobeys the dwarfs. And each time she's nearly killed. And yet she never learns. That's what makes it so eerie. It's not a story of growth, it's a loop of passivity. She gets tricked, dies, gets saved, rinse and repeat. Even stranger, in the edited version, Snow White becomes less a person and more a symbol. She never speaks her own desires. She doesn't fight back. She doesn't even confront the queen. She just floats through the story. A pretty object passed from one caretaker to the next. And the prince? He's barely developed at all. No backstory, no internal conflict. Just a man with a horse, a title, and a disturbing interest in unconscious girls. This version of the story helped define the modern fairy tale. It's the one Disney would later adapt. But make no mistake, underneath the glitter and singing animals, the grim influence is still there. In the silence, in the death traps, in the fact that Snow White wins by staying pretty and still. That's the legacy of the edits. A tale cleaned up for children, but still carrying the bones of something ancient and unsettling. And while the Grimm brothers polished the surface, they never quite scraped off the truth. This wasn't a happily ever after. It was a warning. Let's step out of the forest for a minute and look at real life. Because Snow White's story, especially the part about her being married at 14, wasn't just a weird fairy tale invention. It reflected something painfully real. The long, uncomfortable history of calm child brides. In 18th and 19th century Europe, it wasn't unheard of for girls as young as 12 or 13 to be promised in marriage, especially among royalty and the nobility, where marriages weren't about love, they were political contracts. If your daughter's hand could secure land, peace, or wealth, her age became less important than her dowry. Historians still argue whether these marriages were fully consummated at such young ages or whether couples waited until the girl came of age. But make no mistake, many young girls were legally, socially, and spiritually handed over long before they could understand what marriage even meant. And here's the eerie part. The age 14 wasn't just accepted. In many countries, it was the legal age for marriage with parental consent. In the Catholic Church, for instance, girls could legally marry at 12. 12. Snow White's age in the tale wasn't some dark fantasy, it was on par with reality. One quirky case often mentioned is that of Margaret Beaufort, mother of England's King Henry VII. She was married at C12 and gave birth at C13. She nearly died during childbirth. Her husband was in his mid-20s. Stories like these were common enough that no one flinched. A girl's body wasn't hers. It was a tool, a vessel, a way to carry on lineage and secure alliances. And the younger she was, the more years her husband could expect to enjoy her. That same logic pulses beneath Snow White's tale. She's young, pure, beautiful, and most importantly, unattached. A perfect prize. And what does she do to win her fairy tale ending? Nothing. She's asleep when it all happens. That's the chilling part. She's chosen, not because of who she is, but because she's available, and young, and silent. In modern retellings, we tend to brush past the age issue. We age her up. We soften the prince. We give her more lines, more agency. But in the source text, none of that's there. Snow White is the textbook example of a child bride, passed from stepmother's control to dwarf's cottage, and finally to royal husband, all without a single decision of her own. It's not fantasy, it's history with a prettier dress. So when we say Snow White was married at 14, we're not just looking at a fictional twist. We're looking straight into the eyes of a very old, very real system, one that saw girls as currency. And bedtime stories? Sometimes they're just receipts. If Snow White sounds oddly specific for a fairy tale, that's because some historians think she might have been based on a real person. Enter Maria Sophia Margaretha Katharina von Erthal, a name that long usually comes with a title, and hers was Baroness. Born in 1729 in Lorem, Maine, Bavaria, Maria Sophia's life included some very curious overlaps with the Snow White story. First, she had a stepmother, and not a very nice one. After Maria Sophia's mother died, her father, a local prince of sorts, remarried a noblewoman who was reportedly vain, cold, and very interested in appearances. Sound familiar? Historians still argue whether Maria's stepmother was truly cruel or just caught in a wave of local gossip. But the family lived in a castle, and there's one room in particular that grabs attention, a hall filled with mirrors, crafted by Lore's famous glassworks. Some were even talking mirrors, sort of. These weren't magical, but they had acoustics that allowed sound to bounce eerily, making it seem like the mirrors whispered back. The stuff fairy tales are made of. Now here's where it gets even weirder. Near Lore, deep in the forests, were meaning towns, where children, yes, children, were employed to dig for copper, silver, and other minerals. They were often small enough to fit in tight shafts, stunted in growth, covered in soot. It's easy to see how these tiny, overworked boys could morph into the dwarfs of legend. Maria Sophia's family crest even features, get this, a mirror and an apple tree. That's not a coincidence. That's branding straight out of a fairy tale. One quirky local story says Maria Sophia was kind, gentle, and well-loved by the common people. But after her father's death, her stepmother took control of the family fortune and banished Maria Sophia from the estate. She ended up living in a nearby abbey, cut off from wealth, power, and influence, a princess in exile. Does that sound like a girl wandering into the forest, searching for shelter? We can't prove Maria Sophia inspired the grim version of Snow White, but the pieces line up like breadcrumbs in the woods. A cruel stepmother, a mirror-filled castle, local dwarfs, aka miners, and a young girl erased by the ambitions of older power players. Even if the Grimm brothers didn't know Maria's story directly, they might have heard whispers. Lore was close enough to their circle of folklore collectors. And these tales? They traveled fast, especially the juicy ones. So maybe Snow White wasn't just a fictional creation. Maybe she was a real girl, living under the thumb of a woman obsessed with appearances. Maybe she lost her home, her title, and her future, only to become immortal in a story where she never got to speak for herself. Let's take another look at the Queen. Because if Snow White was possibly inspired by a real Bavarian girl, then the villain might also have roots in someone disturbingly real. Enter the possibility that Snow White's evil stepmother was based on a real-life murderer. Prompt. In the 17th and 18th centuries, stories of wicked noblewomen circulated like wildfire through Germany and surrounding regions. One in particular keeps coming up. Countess Margaretha von Waldeck. She was a noblewoman who lived in the mid-1500s, and her story bears eerie similarities to Snow White's. Margaretha was known for her beauty, so much so that powerful men competed for her hand. She grew up in Wildungen, where, again, child miners worked in narrow tunnels. Her stepmother, widely disliked, and Margaretha herself, she died young. Under strange circumstances, possibly poisoned while staying at court in Brussels. Some historians believe it was her stepmother or someone acting on her stepmother's orders who arranged it. Historians still argue whether Margaretha's death was an act of political sabotage or personal vendetta. No one was ever charged, but the idea of a young woman, beautiful, silent, and dying mysteriously, struck a chord that echoed into legend. Now toss in the Queen's obsession with mirrors, In some German folklore, mirrors weren't just about beauty. They were tools of power, divination, even witchcraft. A woman staring into a mirror wasn't necessarily vain. She might have been consulting it for control, to ask, "Am I still the one who matters?" And every time it said no, her world cracked a little more. And that box? The one with Snow White's organs? It wasn't always just a box. Some versions describe it as a jewelry case, others a locked chest, as if the queen was hiding her crime like a treasured possession. In some twisted versions, she eats the heart thinking it will give her more beauty or more life. There's even a fringe theory, quirky but fascinating, that the queen's punishment with the hot iron shoes was inspired by public executions of accused witches. During the witch trials, condemned women were sometimes forced to walk barefoot across burning embers or were burned alive. The fairy tale may have preserved that imagery, wrapping it in satin ribbons and ball gowns. So maybe this queen wasn't just a cartoon villain. Maybe she was based on the real fears people had at the time, about stepmothers taking over estates, about women who used charm as currency, about powerful widows who refused to fade quietly into the background. Or maybe, just maybe, she was a warning. Not about evil stepmothers, but about what happens to women who lose everything and want it back. Let's bite into the most iconic part of Snow White's story, the poisoned apple. It's red, shiny, and deadly. One bite, and she drops like a stone. It's the moment we all remember. But where did that idea even come from? And could an apple really kill you? In earlier versions of the tale, the apple wasn't the first murder attempt. It was the third eye. A final strike after bodice laces and poisoned combs failed. This wasn't just about killing Snow White. It was about making sure the body looked beautiful after death. That's why the apple was perfect. A clean death. No blood, no bruises, just a quiet collapse. Historians still argue whether the apple was meant to echo the biblical fruit of knowledge from the Garden of Eden. You know the one. Eve takes a bite, and suddenly everything changes. Knowledge, shame, mortality. In both stories, a woman takes a bite, and the world collapses around her. Except in this case, it's not a snake whispering, but a queen in disguise. Now, could an actual poisoned apple kill you? Maybe, but not how the fairy tale says. One quirky historical tidbit: during the Middle Ages, Atropa belladonna, also called deadly nightshade, was a known poison. Its berries could kill, but its extract was also used to dilate pupils and enhance beauty. In small amounts, it made women look dreamy and alluring. In large doses, it made them very, very dead. Some think the queen might have used something like that. Mix a little nightshade into the apple. Just enough to knock Snow White out, make her look dead. Not enough to cause rot or decay. If you wanted a corpse in a glass box that still looked like a porcelain doll, that'd do it. But here's the strange part. In some versions of the tale, it's not even magic or poison that does her in. It's a chunk of apple stuck in her throat. No spell, no curse, just a choking hazard. In fact, in the 1812 Grimm version, the dwarfs refuse to bury her because her body doesn't rot. So they put her in a coffin made of glass and gold, and when the prince's men drop the coffin, that apple piece dislodges from her throat, and she wakes up. No kiss, no true love, just a glorified Heimlich maneuver. And the queen? She never learns that her weapon failed. She's at home, asking her mirror for updates, thinking she's won. All the while, her rival is waking up in a stranger's arms. That apple? It wasn't just fruit. It was fate. It was the story's pivot point, and it gave us the perfect fairy tale image. Innocence, poisoned by beauty, sealed behind glass. So next time you see a shiny red apple in a market stall, maybe don't lean in too close, especially if the seller's wearing a hood. Let's take a closer look at Snow White's unlikely roommates, the 7 dwarfs. They're usually played for laughs. Bumbling, lovable, sometimes grumpy little guys with funny names and matching hats. But the original Grimm version? No silly nicknames, no musical numbers. Just 7 unnamed, small, hard-working men who live deep in the forest. They weren't magical, they were miners. That's the key detail people often miss. These men worked in the mountains, hammering away at stone and hauling out precious minerals, and they weren't fantasy creations. They were pulled from the real-life labor force of 19th century Germany. In places like the Harz Mountains, child labor was a harsh reality. Boys as young as 8 were sent underground, where narrow tunnels suited small bodies. Historians still argue whether the dwarfs were meant to symbolize these real child miners, overworked, underfed, and stunted in growth, or whether they were drawn from older European folklore about mountain spirits who guarded treasure. Maybe both. But in the Grimm's tale, the magical sparkle is faint. These dwarfs cook, clean, and head off to work with pickaxes every day. It's less once upon a time and more clock in, dig, survive. One quirky historical link? Some mining towns had legends of Earthmen or little people. Who knew where gold veins ran? These stories blurred the line between superstition and desperate hope. If a mine collapsed or a vein went dry, people blamed or thanked the dwarfs. Now think about this. These 7 men take Snow White in, but not out of charity. She finds their cottage, helps herself to food, and falls asleep in a bed. When they return, their first instinct is suspicion, but when they see her beauty, they soften. And they offer her a deal, not freedom, but a bargain. She can stay, if she cooks and cleans for them. So yes, she's safe from the queen, but only if she plays the housekeeper. Not exactly the dream of independence. And when the queen starts her next round of murder attempts, the dwarfs offer rules. Don't open the door, don't take gifts. But when she breaks those rules, over and over, they don't punish her. They just revive her, warn her again, and leave for work. They're not heroes. They're not villains. They're just tired. Like everyone else in this tale, they're locked in a loop. Work, sleep, survival. Maybe that's why they don't ask questions. Not when she arrives, not when she collapses, not when the prince carts her off. It's a strange setup. A group of old, stunted men, a girl who cooks and obeys, a cabin in the woods where everyone avoids the outside world. But it's also a reflection of labor, of isolation, of how beauty, even in the middle of nowhere, can twist everything. Let's return to that chilling image. The glass coffin. Snow White, perfectly preserved, lying still in a box like some museum artifact. It's one of the most haunting parts of the story. But where did this idea even come from? And why a glass coffin of all things? In the Grimm tale, the dwarfs are so overwhelmed by her beauty they refuse to bury her. Instead, they build a coffin from glass and gold, place her inside, and set it on a hill in the forest. They watch over her every day. No rot, no decay, just endless mourning. Historians still argue whether the coffin was meant to be symbolic, a shrine to innocence and purity, or a critique of how society tends to freeze women in time, trapping them in ideals they can never escape. Either way, the message is pretty clear. Snow White's value peaks in death. Silent, untouchable, beautiful. But this glass coffin isn't just fantasy fluff. It echoes a real and very creepy historical practice. In 18th and 19th century Europe, especially among the upper class, it was common to put the bodies of children and young women on display for mourning. Wake viewings, sometimes lasting days, were held in parlors. And yes, sometimes those coffins had glass lids, allowing mourners to gaze at the deceased without opening the casket. One quirky example? The famous Sleeping Beauty of Palermo, Rosalia Lombardo. Preserved in 1920 at the age of 2, her tiny body was treated with special chemicals and placed in a glass-covered coffin. Even today, she looks like she's simply napping. It's unsettling and fascinating. So the idea of Snow White in a crystal-clear box? Not that far from reality. But think about what it means in the story. She's not dead, not fully, just trapped. Frozen in time, on display like a doll. The dwarfs don't try to bury her. They don't let go. They just watch. And then comes the prince, who doesn't see her as a person, but as a beaten possession. something beautiful, something pure, something to own. He doesn't ask about her name, her past, her wishes. He wants her because she's beautiful and doesn't move. In a sense, the glass coffin is like a showroom case. Look, but don't touch. Or wait. Maybe do. This moment marks one of the story's strangest turns. The coffin, instead of being a symbol of death, becomes a gift box. And Snow White, the prize inside. She wakes only after the prince acquires her. That's not just romantic confusion. That's a message. A girl's story doesn't restart until she's claimed. So, yeah, a glittering glass coffin sounds magical. But in truth, it's more like a transparent prison, a shrine to perfection. And another way the story reminds us, beauty may be powerful, but it's also a trap. The huntsman shows up early in the story, but his moment is a big one. He's ordered to take Snow White deep into the forest and kill her. Not just that, he's told to bring back her lungs and liver. As proof, that's not just murder. That's a full-on hit job with a side of medieval organ delivery. Let's talk about the guy for a second. He doesn't have a name. He doesn't get a backstory. But in that one scene, he faces a huge decision. And for a tale that doesn't offer many moments of human emotion, his pause, his brief rebellion, feels enormous. He takes her into the woods. She cries, begs, and he can't go through with it. He tells her to run, escape, live. Then he kills a wild boar and takes its organs instead, fooling the queen into thinking her plan worked. Historians still argue whether the huntsman's mercy was meant to show a crack in the system, proof that even in a cruel world someone can still choose kindness. Or was he just too afraid to kill a child? Either way, he becomes the first and possibly only character in the story who makes a moral choice. Everyone else? Just reacting, obeying, surviving. The queen? She eats those boar organs, believing they're Snow White's, and she enjoys it. There's no spell, no ritual, just good old-fashioned cannibalism. Now here's a quirky historical tidbit. In many ancient cultures, people believed that eating the heart or liver of an enemy could transfer their power, youth, or their spirit. Warriors did it, royalty did it, sometimes symbolically, sometimes not. So the queen's creepy dinner isn't just gross, it's strategic. In her mind, she's not just eliminating the competition, she's absorbing her. But the real weight of this moment lies with the huntsman. He walks away knowing he disobeyed the queen. He disappears from the story entirely after that. We never hear what happens to him. Did he flee the kingdom? Was he executed for betrayal? Or did he keep the secret forever? One fringe theory suggests he reappears later, disguised as the prince's servant, the one who drops the coffin and accidentally revives Snow White. Wild, right? No proof, just fairy tale fan theories in action. But think about what the huntsman represents. He's the only adult man in the story who meets Snow White while she's awake, vulnerable, and alive, and chooses not to harm her. He lets her go, gives her a chance to find her own way. It's not romantic, it's not dramatic. But in this tale full of poison and manipulation, it's something rare. Decency. And maybe that's why he vanishes. Because kindness doesn't fit in a world where beauty, betrayal, and death rule the script. So, let's linger for a moment on that gruesome little package. The one the huntsman is supposed to bring back to the queen. Not just a bloodied cloth, not a lock of hair. She wants Snow White's lungs and liver in a box. That's specific. In some early versions of the tale, it's not just a box. It's described as a jewelry casket, sometimes made of wood or ivory, which adds a weird layer of elegance to an otherwise stomach-turning request. The queen wants to turn her stepdaughter into a trophy, something beautiful, something she can consume. Historians still argue whether this detail was meant to reflect actual death rituals or was simply a literary shock tactic. But here's a fact. Organs like the heart, liver, and lungs were symbolically powerful in many cultures. The mountain liver in particular was once believed to be the seat of emotion and vitality, even more important than the heart. To eat someone's liver wasn't just gory, it was spiritually loaded. So when the queen demands these organs, It's not just out of bloodlust. It's like she's trying to erase Snow White from the inside out. The quirky twist. This isn't unique to the Snow White tale. In other European folktales, there are similar scenes. Stepmothers eating daughters, queens devouring rivals, all in an attempt to steal youth or beauty. In one Italian version, the queen eats a beating heart and bathes in the blood. Talk about skincare routines gone wrong. And let's not forget, she doesn't know she's being tricked. The huntsman brings her the organs of a wild boar, and she roasts them with saltini and eats them for dinner. That detail appears in several early versions. Not a quick snack, a whole prepared meal. That's how invested she is in eliminating the competition. But what does it mean that she believes the organs are real? That she's satisfied? That she finally feels safe again? It says that in her world, proof of death is physical, tangible. She needs to hold it, chew it, swallow it. Until she does, Snow White remains a threat, a ghost in the mirror. And that box, tucked away in the castle, hiding fake organs, becomes a turning point. Because from that moment on, the queen thinks she's won. She relaxes. She stops hunting. She lets the kingdom breathe. And Snow White? She's finally free. For a little while, anyway. So next time someone says fairy tales are harmless, just remind them. This one comes with a to-go box of pretend human organs. Bon appétit. Let's talk about the ending. Not the happily ever after part. The part before that. The revenge. Because in most versions of Snow White, the villain doesn't just get defeated. She gets humiliated, tortured, and then killed. Right in front of the wedding guests. Here's how it goes. The queen shows up to Snow White's wedding, still unaware the bride is the girl she tried to murder multiple times. When she walks in and sees Snow White alive and glowing, her face drops. The mirror lied, or maybe finally told the truth. And the punishment? A pair of red-hot iron shoes, pulled straight from the fire, forced onto her feet. She's made to dance as in them until she dies. No trial, no chance to flee, just a public, fiery spectacle. Historians still argue whether this was meant as justice or just good old-fashioned revenge fantasy. It's certainly not subtle. The wicked woman who spent the whole story trying to destroy beauty now gets destroyed by heat, pain, and spectacle. The imagery is theatrical, almost cartoonish, but with real, brutal roots. One quirky detail: this form of punishment might have been inspired by real medieval execution methods. There were undocumented cases of people being forced to walk over burning coals or wear heated metal shoes as torture, mostly accused witches, heretics, or traitors. So while this fairy tale exaggerates, it's not totally off script for the era. And here's the strange part. Snow White never speaks during this scene. She doesn't forgive, doesn't protest. She just watches, maybe approving, maybe numb. The story doesn't tell us. That's silence again. But there's something deeper here. A message. Because let's be honest, the queen wasn't punished for trying to kill someone. She was punished because she lost up. If she'd succeeded, there would be no wedding, no glass coffin, no prince, no story. The queen's crime wasn't murder, it was failure. In some ways, this violent ending feels like a child's version of justice, like the kind of twisted bedtime logic where the bad guy always gets what's coming in the most ridiculous, over-the-top way possible. Dance in burning shoes? Sure, that's what you get for being mean. But viewed another way, it's a chilling reflection of how fairy tales handle female ambition. The queen wanted to stay in power, stay beautiful, stay relevant, and for that, she had to be destroyed. Not quietly, loudly, painfully, publicly. And Snow White? She doesn't need to fight. She doesn't need to plan. She just has to exist. Beautiful, young, silent. That alone is enough to undo her rival. So this final scene? It's not a celebration. It's a performance, a staged morality play. And like all performances, it leaves the audience clapping, while something uncomfortable lingers in the air. Because justice in this story doesn't heal, it burns. Let's finally take a long, uncomfortable look at the prince, because up to this point, he's barely done anything, and yet he walks away with the bride, the crown, and the fairy tale ending. But who is he, really? And what kind of man falls in love with a girl in a glass coffin? When he first sees Snow White, she's not dancing, she's not talking, she's not even breathing. She's motionless, sealed under glass, surrounded by grieving dwarfs. And somehow, this is the moment he falls in love. In most modern retellings, they cut around this detail. They make the prince's love seem sweet, magical, noble, but in the Grimm version, it's far weirder. He literally begs the dwarfs to give her to him as a gift, as a keepsake, not because he knows her, but because he wants her. Historians still argue whether the prince is meant to represent purity and love, or obsession and entitlement. Was this a story of faded romance, or was it just about a man claiming something he thought was beautiful, regardless of consent? And remember, she's how? 14. Maybe younger in earlier versions. She never speaks to him before or after he falls in love. She doesn't get to ask questions. She just wakes up and finds herself engaged. One quirky note in the 1812 version: the prince never kisses her. There's no true love's kiss. Instead, his servants accidentally drop the coffin, and the piece of poisoned apple pops out of her throat. That's it. No magic. Just a bump in the road. So, technically, he didn't even save her. He just happened to be the guy who was there when the apple came loose. Then she opens her eyes, blinks, sees a stranger, and agrees to marry him. It's not clear why. Maybe she's confused. Maybe she thinks this is her reward for surviving. Maybe she doesn't think she has a choice. But either way, the prince walks away a winner. No risks, no quests, just a dead girl in a box who happens to be very, very pretty. It says something about the tale's values. The queen schemes, plots, disguises herself 3 times and still loses. The prince strolls in, says, "I want that," and gets everything. In fairy tales, action is usually rewarded. But here, inaction is the true power move. Snow White stays quiet, stays still, and is rewarded. The prince does nothing heroic, and is rewarded. The queen fights tooth and nail, and dies in fire. And let's not forget how bizarre the proposal really is. She wakes up, and according to the story, he asks her to marry him. Immediately. No small talk. No, "How did you get in this coffin?" Just straight to the altar. And she says yes, because this isn't about love. It's about ownership. The prince claims her, and in doing so, finishes the tale. Her story ends when he enters it. No wonder modern rewrites are flipping the script. Because in the original, Prince Charming isn't charming at all. He's just the guy who showed up last and walked away with the prize. Snow White doesn't speak much throughout her story, but her silence says volumes. She's not a rebel. She's not clever. She's not even particularly curious. She mostly reacts, obeys, and waits. And yet, she becomes queen. How? Let's break it down. From the beginning, Snow White is positioned as an object of value, not an agent of her own fate. Her beauty is described in vivid, obsessive detail. Her thoughts? Never. We know she's fair. We know she's delicate. But we don't know what she wants. Historians still argue whether this silence was meant to reflect ideal female behavior in the 1800s, or whether it's just the natural byproduct of male authors writing female characters as plot devices. Either way, Snow White doesn't shape her destiny. Other people do. Her stepmother, the huntsman, the dwarfs, the prince. And the dwarfs? They don't adopt her because she's clever or strong. They let her stay because she agrees to keep house. That's her role: maid, caretaker, rule follower. They tell her what to do. She nods, and when she breaks the rule, opens the door to the disguised queen. She gets punished. No lectures, no second chances. Just collapse. In a way, her silence protects her. It makes her non-threatening. The queen hates her beauty, yes, but Snow White never fights back. She doesn't plot revenge. She doesn't try to escape. She simply exists, and everyone around her reacts. That's the eerie part, the quirky bit. In some older folk tales that inspired Snow White, The female lead is even more passive. She doesn't wake up at all. She's carried home by the prince, displayed like a trophy in his palace, and only revives when his mother tries to cook her for dinner. Suddenly, Snow White opens her eyes and screams, not because she's in love, but because she's about to be eaten. Back in the Grimm version, she wakes up, says one sentence, and the next thing we know, she's getting married. There's no moment of self-discovery, no desire expressed, no voice raised. And yet she's rewarded. That's because in many traditional fairy tales, especially those aimed at girls, virtue equals silence. The ideal heroine doesn't resist. She endures. She doesn't change her world. She survives it. And that survival, it's framed as victory. Snow White's passivity isn't a bug in the story. It's the feature. She doesn't need to be wise or brave or bold. She needs to be beautiful, obedient, and still. Which raises the uncomfortable question, what was this story teaching its audience? That being good means being quiet? That danger comes when you speak? That happy endings come to those who wait, no matter how strange, unconscious, or coffin-bound they are? So maybe Snow White wasn't just a passive princess. Maybe she was a mirror too, reflecting back everything the world expected a girl to be, and nothing more. Let's talk about stepmothers. In fairy tales, they're nearly always the villain. Cold, jealous, power-hungry, and nowhere is that truer than in Snow White. But where did this wicked stepmother trope even come from? And why did stories keep turning loving parental figures into monsters? In the original 1812 Grimm version, the queen was not a stepmother. She was Snow White's biological mother. That's right. The woman who orders her daughter's death, tries to poison her 3 times, and plans to eat her organs wasn't some evil replacement. She was mom. But readers, especially middle-class parents, didn't like that. So in later editions, the Grimms quietly changed it. Stepmother now. Problem solved. Evil no longer runs in the bloodline. Historians still argue whether this shift was about making the story more palatable or if it reflected deeper social tensions. Because in 19th century Europe, step families were common. Disease, childbirth, and war meant that many children lost a parent and grew up with new ones, especially stepmothers. And in households where inheritance and status were everything, tensions could run high. Stepmothers were often caught in an impossible bind. They were expected to care for children who weren't their own, while also protecting their own biological children and interests. Resentment, favoritism, and distrust were sadly common. Fairy tales just turned these domestic dramas into epic moral stories. And here's the quirky twist. In older folklore, there's often no stepmother at all, just a bad mother. One version from Albania features a mother who tries to bury her daughter alive. In a Persian version, the queen sends her daughter to the desert with a poisoned date. The idea of maternal danger runs deep, and only in more sanitized versions do we swap the title. So why does Snow White's queen get so much hate? Because she breaks the most sacred rule, protect the child. Instead, she competes with her. She sees Snow White's youth and beauty not as blessings, but as threats. In a world where women's power was fleeting, tied to age, fertility, appearance, losing that power to your own daughter would have felt like betrayal. The mirror doesn't just show a younger face, it shows replacement. Justo, that's what makes the queen so desperate, so cruel, and so strangely human. She isn't evil because she wants power. She's evil because she refuses to fade away. Snow White's rise means the queen's fall, and in a culture that pitted women against each other for survival, this wasn't just rivalry, it was survival instinct. So maybe the queen isn't just a cartoon villain. Maybe she's a portrait of what happens when women are told their worth has an expiration date. And fairy tales? They didn't write that rule. They just mirrored it back. Let's wander back into the forest, the place where Snow White finds refuge, mystery, and danger all at once. Because in fairy tales, the forest is never just a bunch of trees. It's a character, a force, a test. When the huntsman lets Snow White go, she runs into the deep, dark woods. She's alone. She's terrified. And yet, she survives. That moment marks her transition from royal girl to wandering orphan. And the forest? It's her gateway. Historians still argue whether forests in folklore represent chaos or freedom, or maybe both. In traditional European tales, the forest was a place beyond the rules of society, beyond kings and castles, beyond mirrors and poisoned apples, but also beyond safety. It's where wild things live, where witches hide, where deals are struck and identities are lost. But for Snow White, the forest becomes something else. An escape fantasy. A place where she's no longer the target of the queen's rage. A place where men won't try to kill her. For a little while, anyway. It's lawless, yes, but it's also where she finds the dwarfs and with them, temporary protection. The quirky thing is that in 19th century Germany, forests weren't fairy tale symbols. They were literal and massive. Dense, shadowy, full of real wolves and real fear. The Black Forest, for example, inspired countless legends of disappearing children, ghostly lights, and whispering trees. So when audiences heard, "She ran into the forest," they didn't imagine a park trail. They imagined vanishing into something ancient and untamed. And here's the strange part. Fairy tales often treat the forest as a feminine space. It's wild, intuitive, emotional. Unlike the court, which is logical and rigid. In the forest, transformation happens. Red Riding Hood meets the wolf. Hansel and Gretel burn the witch. Snow White finds a cottage and makes a new life. It's also the only place in the story where she's not being watched. No mirror, no queen, no prince, just trees, shadows, time. The story never tells us how long she's in the woods. It could be days, could be years. That ambiguity adds to the dreamlike quality. It's a space out of time. Some scholars even suggest the forest represents adolescence, a confusing in-between state where you're no longer a child but not yet an adult. That fits Snow White perfectly. She runs into the woods a girl. She comes out a queen. But the space between? That's the blur. And like all fairy tales, the moment she finds security, rules, structure, a job sweeping up after dwarfs, the forest closes. The queen finds her again. Danger returns, because even the wild doesn't last forever. Still, it's worth remembering, the forest didn't try to kill her. People did. The trees may have whispered, but they never lied. Let's talk about Snow White's greatest weapon and her greatest weakness, her beauty. It's what defines her, what protects her, and ultimately what almost gets her killed, again and again. From the very first sentence, she's described in sensory terms. White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony. These aren't just colors. They're symbols. Purity, vitality, mystery, the perfect trio. It's like she's designed, not born. And once the queen hears that Snow White is 1,000 times fairer, everything shifts. Beauty becomes obsession, not just for the queen, but for everyone who meets her. The huntsman spares her life because he can't bring himself to harm such a beautiful girl. The dwarfs welcome her because of her appearance. The prince falls in love with her body in a box. Historians still argue whether the tale was meant to critique this obsession or if it simply reflects society's values. Either way, beauty here isn't just surface level. It's a kind of currency. And Snow White has it in abundance. But it's a double-edged sword. Her beauty attracts the queen's wrath. Her beauty brings the poisoned apple. Her beauty keeps her on display long after death. In many ways, her perfection makes her passive. Because when you're that admired, the story doesn't ask what you think. It just watches. And there's a quirky, uncomfortable truth behind that idea. In many early societies, physical beauty in young girls was seen as an asset, to be protected, arranged, even traded. A beautiful daughter could be married off well. A beautiful wife could enhance a man's status. That kind of thinking bleeds through the story. Even Snow White's behavior fits the mold. She's polite. She cleans. She doesn't argue. She accepts rules and follows them, most of the time. Her only mistake? Letting in the disguised queen. And what's she tempted by? Beauty products. A lace bodice. A comb. A perfect apple. It's like the queen uses her own vanity for against her eye, which raises the question, Is Snow White really naive? Or is she trained to value beauty so highly that she can't resist the tools that promise to enhance it? And let's not forget the glass coffin. It's the final display case, a crystal frame around her perfection. The dwarfs don't bury her because her cheeks were still red. That's what matters. Not her mind, not her soul, just her color palette. Some scholars see this as a commentary on how women are frozen by society's expectations. Forever youthful, forever beautiful, forever quiet, even after death. And the prince? He doesn't know her, doesn't speak to her, but he wants her. And in fairy tales, want equals win. So Snow White's beauty is her power, but it's also her prison. Because in a story like this, you can't ever age, you can't ever change. You can only be perfect, or you can disappear. Fairy tales love their archetypes. The wicked queen, the silent maiden, the noble prince. But at the heart of Snow White's story lies a stark contrast between two women, both wielding power in very different ways. One through fear, the other through beauty. Let's look at the queen first. She's active, clever, ambitious. She disguises herself, brews poisons, plots complex schemes, and she speaks, oh, she speaks, to her mirror, to Snow White, to herself. She drives the story forward for better or worse. Then there's Snow White, passive, gentle, obedient. She follows orders. She cooks, she cleans, she doesn't question. Her power lies in being, not doing. Historians still argue whether this dynamic was meant to showcase the right way for a woman to behave, rewarding Snow White's meekness and punishing the queen's defiance. Or was it more complicated? A warning about what happens when women fight each other instead of the system. Either way, fairy tales often pit women against women. The queen's not threatened by armies, or politics, or plague. She's threatened by a girl with good skin and a symmetrical face. That's it. That's all it takes to unravel her. And here's the quirky part. In some older versions, the queen's powers aren't magical. They're medical. One folktale shows her as an herbalist, a skilled user of plants and tinctures. That makes her less a sorceress, more a scientist. But because her knowledge threatens the natural order, she's painted as evil. Snow White, on the other hand, relies on luck, on others, on fate. She's protected, not proactive. She doesn't fight back. She wins by not dying. In a way, both women are trapped. The queen by her fear of aging, Snow White by her duty to stay young and pretty forever. The story doesn't offer them much room to grow. And think about how their power is judged. The queen's ambition is punished. Her intelligence is punished. Her sakin voice is punished. Snow White's silence rewarded. That sends a message, one that's echoed across centuries of storytelling. The dangerous woman thinks and speaks. The good woman smiles and listens. But here's a thought. What if this tale isn't just about good versus evil, but about how limited the choices were for women in the world that created it? Be pretty or be feared. Be quiet or be burned. It's not much of a choice at all. And maybe that's the darkest part of the fairy tale. Not the poisoned apple, not the glass coffin, but the roles these women are forced to play again and again without ever getting to rewrite the script. The Grimm brothers weren't just collectors of folktales. They were editors too. And over time they scrubbed, softened, and reshaped their versions of stories like Snow White to match what they thought children should hear. But even their cleanest version couldn't fully erase the shadows underneath. In the earliest 1812 edition, the queen was Snow White's biological mother. That's a brutal idea. A mother so jealous of her daughter's beauty that she'd order her lungs and liver served for dinner. But as their readership expanded, especially among parents, the Grimms quietly made changes. By the 1857 version, the mother became a Watts stepmother. And some of the most disturbing details were dialed down, but not removed. Historians still argue whether the Grimms saw themselves as preserving folklore or purifying it. They wanted to protect German identity, but they also had an eye on the marketplace. If a tale was too bloody, too bizarre, or too blasphemous, it got a makeover. Still, some dark things lingered. The quirky thing? As the queen's relationship to Snow White became more sanitized, Her death became more graphic. The earlier editions didn't include the red-hot iron shoes, but the 1857 version? Full dance of fire. It's almost like the Grimms traded one horror for another. Less psychological trauma, more physical punishment. And they didn't just change character relationships, they added moral structure. In the early tellings, Snow White accepts the old woman's gifts with no hesitation. Later, the dwarfs warn her. She's told not to open the door. She disobeys. There's a lesson now. Obey your guardians, or suffer the consequences. The edits also emphasized her innocence. Her beauty became almost holy, her passivity noble. These weren't just changes, they were instructions. The prince? He too got buffed up. Early versions hinted that he was obsessed with her body. Later ones framed his love as pure, true, even noble. His desire became romantic instead of, well, weird. And what about the dwarfs? In the early versions, they're harsh, stern. In later ones, they become gentler, jolly, almost fatherly. The idea of 7 gruff miners housing a young girl gets repackaged into a wholesome little family unit, safe for bedtime. But even with all the sugarcoating, the bones of the original story still stick out. A child is hunted, poisoned, displayed in a coffin, claimed by a stranger, and the villain? Burned alive in front of a wedding crowd. You can put that in fancy script and call it a bedtime story, but the darkness is still there, just beneath the lace trim. So when people say the Grimms made their tales family-friendly, they're not wrong. But friendly in the 1800s still included attempted murder, cannibalism, and dancing in molten shoes. Because some things you just can't scrub away. And now we arrive at the 20th century makeover Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The first full-length animated feature film, a global sensation, a technical marvel, and perhaps the most dramatic polish the story ever got. Walt Disney took the Grimm version, trimmed its thorns, and gave it a voice, literally, with songs, birds, choreographed sweeping. Suddenly this tale of jealousy and child endangerment was a musical. But what did Disney change? And what did he quietly leave the same? For starters, Snow White still looks young, very young. Disney never gives her an age, but her voice, animation, and behavior make her seem somewhere between 12 and 16. She acts more like a giggly middle schooler than a future queen. And yet, she's still pursued by a prince who, frankly, gives off big, grown man energy. Historians still argue whether Disney intended for her youth to be literal or simply part of the character's fairy tale innocence. But either way, it plays into the same dynamic. She's pure, passive, and precious. What Disney did remove were the grosser details. No organ eating, no suffocation by bodice lace, no poisoned comb. Just the one apple, now presented with flair and a dramatic cackle. It's more theatrical, less surgical. The quirky part? The poisoned apple sequence is animated like a horror film. The queen turns into a crone. The lighting goes dark. Lightning flashes. We still get danger, but in cartoon form. Enough to scare kids, not scar them. And the dwarfs, they're no longer stern miners. They're lovable caricatures, each with a name and a single emotion. Dopey, grumpy, bashful, happy, sleepy, sneezy, Doc. They sing, they dance, they wash up before dinner. They became so iconic that most people think their names came from the original tale, but they didn't. The prince gets a soft makeover too. No creepy coffin carting, no love at first, sightless sight. In Disney's version, he sings to Snow White early on, planting the idea of romance before the poison comes into play. And yes, he kisses her awake, reviving her with true love's kiss. But here's the thing, she's still asleep, still passive, still chosen, not choosing. And the ending? A white horse, a golden sunset, a dreamy castle in the clouds, no hot shoes, no screaming queen, just a fall from a cliff and some helpful lightning. Disney cut the gore but kept the moral. Good girls win, wicked women fall. Some scholars believe Disney's Snow White set the blueprint for every animated princess that followed. Sweet, soft-spoken, obedient, and awaiting rescue. But in doing so, it also buried the core weirdness of the original, the question marks. What we got instead was a bedtime version, a lullaby layered over a ghost story. And for most of the world, that's the Snow White they remember. Not the girl in the glass box, but the girl with birds on her fingers singing into a wishing well, waiting for someone else to write her final page. So after all that, the murder plots, the poisoned gifts, the glass coffin, and the awkward kiss, what exactly was Snow White supposed to teach girls? On the surface, it seems simple. Be kind. Be gentle. Be good. But underneath that sparkle is a different kind of message. One that's been whispered through centuries of storytelling. Be beautiful, be quiet, and maybe a prince will save you. That's the core lesson that generations of girls absorbed, even if they didn't realize it. Snow White isn't praised for her ideas. She doesn't have dreams of her own. She doesn't question her fate. Her only consistent action is obedience, following orders, doing chores, staying pretty. Historians still argue whether this was meant as a survival guide in a patriarchal world or just lazy storytelling. But the outcome is the same. In the end, Snow White wins because she's the fairest, not the bravest or the smartest. And let's not forget, she literally dies for being pretty. The queen isn't threatened by her power. She's threatened by her reflection. One quirky detail buried in older European versions: Snow White's resurrection is sometimes treated like a rebirth, complete with a changed name or status. Some folklorists believe this symbolizes a girl's transition into womanhood, or rather, marriage, as the point where a girl's story becomes complete. You sleep, you wake, you wed. The tale reinforces a cycle. A girl is helpless, is hurt, is saved, and then is no longer a girl. She's a bride, a queen. But only because she was chosen, not because she chose. Even her death serves a purpose. It freezes her in time. While the world around her keeps moving, she's preserved, watched over, admired, until someone with more power comes along and claims her. That's not love. That's ownership. And for centuries, girls heard this story before bed, watched it in theaters, wore the costumes, sang the songs, all while internalizing that their best qualities were surface deep. Be nice, be quiet, don't complain, don't age. And one day, someone will see how special you are and lift you out of the forest. But here's the thing. Snow White never saves herself. She doesn't defeat the queen. She doesn't escape the coffin. Her life is controlled by everyone else in the story. She's acted upon, not acting, which makes you wonder. What happens after the story ends? Does she finally find her voice? Or does she keep smiling, keep nodding, and keep living in a castle someone else built? Because the real message isn't about love or magic, it's about waiting. And waiting isn't living. But here's the good news. Today's storytellers aren't sticking to the old script. In fact, they're tossing it out entirely. Snow White has been rewritten, reimagined, and flipped inside out by writers, filmmakers, and artists who saw something deeper under the ribbons and red apples, something begging for a new voice. Modern retellings don't always keep her silent. They don't always keep her sweet. Sometimes they don't even keep her human. Take Snow White and the Huntsman, 2012, where she's a brooding warrior queen leading armies, swinging swords, and, finally, making decisions. Or Mirror Mirror, 2012, a quirky comedy where the queen is more charming than cruel, and Snow White doesn't wait around for a prince, she outsmarts him. There's even Blancanieves, a Spanish silent film that reimagines her as a 1920s bullfighter. Yes, a cape, a sword, and no glass coffins in sight. And then there are the darker, grittier versions, like Neil Gaiman's Snow Glass Apples, which turns the entire tale inside out, told from the queen's perspective, where Snow White is the monster. That one's not for bedtime. Historians still argue whether these retellings are correcting the past or just modernizing a classic. But one thing is clear: they give Snow White agency, they give her a voice, and finally, a say in how her story unfolds. Here's a quirky example. In some indie comic book versions, the dwarfs aren't minors. They're exiled gods or shapeshifters, or even revolutionaries hiding from a corrupt kingdom. Snow White joins them, not as a housemaid, but as an equal, And some authors go even further, asking, what if she never woke up? What if she didn't want to? One striking poem imagines Snow White refusing the kiss, preferring her dreams, choosing to stay asleep in a world of her own making, rather than live in a world built for someone else's fantasy. And then there are feminist takes, where the queen isn't the villain. She's the warning. A woman clawing for relevance in a society that praises youth and discards age. A woman punished for ambition, while her younger rival is rewarded for passivity. These new versions don't always have neat endings, but they ask better questions. Like, why must beauty always be her power? Why can't she rescue herself? Why do we keep telling girls they're only valuable when they're quiet, clean, and unconscious? Today, Snow White can be anything. A hacker, a spy, a rebel, a leader, a survivor. And maybe that's the point. She was never supposed to be frozen in a glass box. She was supposed to break it. No matter how many new versions we create, Snow White keeps coming back. She's everywhere. Books, shows, memes, Halloween costumes. But why? Why does this one fairy tale out of thousands haunt us the way it does? Maybe it's because it taps into something universal. The fear of being replaced. The pressure to be perfect. The longing to be seen. And the terror of being seen too much. Snow White is simple on the surface. But under that surface, deep, dark water. A girl poisoned by vanity. A mother figure driven to madness. A man who falls in love with death. It's not a fairy tale. It's a nightmare wearing perfume. Historians still argue whether the story endures because of its archetypes or its adaptability. It's flexible. You can set it in medieval Europe or modern Tokyo. You can swap the apple for a phone, the mirror for social media, the prince for a CEO. It still works. The themes don't age. And here's the quirky part. Even when we think we've outgrown her, she shows up again. In horror films, in fashion ads, in music videos, in every makeover reality show where beauty is presented as salvation. The mirror never really goes away. In some ways, we've become the queen, checking our reflections, comparing, calculating worth based on image. And we've also become Snow White, curating our innocence, waiting for likes, hoping someone will discover us. The story's been retold as feminist triumph, as queer awakening, as psychological thriller. In some versions, the queen is the hero. In others, Snow White doesn't wake up. Sometimes she poisons herself, just to escape. It's not the characters that change, it's the lens. And maybe that's why it endures. Because Snow White isn't just one girl. She's every girl who's ever been told to smile, to stay quiet, to be lovely but not loud, delicate but not demanding. She's every girl who's been underestimated herself and waited just a little too long for someone to say, "You're worth saving." Even now she lingers, in stories, in symbols, in those quiet moments where we wonder if the world wants us for who we are, or how we look. The tale is old, but the question it asks, still sharp as the bite of an apple. So here we are, at the edge of the story, staring into the shimmer of that infamous glass coffin. The tale is over, but its echoes are still humming through culture, history, and imagination. Because Snow White wasn't just a fairy tale princess. She was a mirror, a metaphor, and in some ways, a warning. She was born of longing, a queen's whispered wish at a snowy window. She was chased, hidden, poisoned, preserved. She was chosen, but never asked. She was crowned, but never spoke. And through it all, she remained beautiful. That was her only constant, her only weapon, and her only curse. The queen. She was punished not for being evil, but for being too much, too proud, too loud, too ambitious, too old. And her reward was pain, wrapped in ceremony, performed like justice. The prince? He wanted her because she was lovely and lifeless. That's it. No shared dreams, no conversation, no agency. And still, this story was passed down for centuries as something to aspire to. Historians still argue whether Snow White survived because of its archetypal simplicity, or because we, deep down, believe that stillness and sweetness will be rewarded. That if we're good and quiet, someone will lift us out of our glass boxes. That someday, a voice will whisper, "You're the fairest of them all," and it will finally mean something. But here's the dark truth. Snow White didn't really get a happy ending. She got an ending. One written by others, sealed in silence, wrapped in lace. And that's the part that lingers. Because for all the poisoned apples, magic mirrors, and burning shoes, the scariest thing about Snow White is this: she never got to choose her own story. And the world kept telling her it was a fairy tale. Now, take a breath. Let the final image fade. A girl in a gown, blinking in sunlight, stepping from glass into gold. Let the woods go quiet. Let the mirror go dark. You're safe now. Let your limbs soften. Let your eyes grow heavy. The cruel queen is gone. The forest is still. The story, for tonight, is over. And you? You get to wake up tomorrow and write your own. Sleep tight.